Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Exam Review Explainer series. Today, we've got an absolutely fantastic masterclass lined up for you, specifically tailored for your Grade 12 English exam. We're going to be diving deep into the essay on libraries by the incredible Oliver Sacks. Now, if you aren't familiar with him, well, Oliver Sacks was a brilliant neurologist, a super prolific author, and honestly a man whose entire life and intellect were completely shaped by libraries. We're going to break down this beautiful, poignant essay and structure the analysis so you are perfectly prepped for your upcoming exams.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's what we'll be covering today. We'll start with the physical library experience, move on to freedom and serendipitous discovery, and then explore community among the shelves. After that, we'll hit the 1990s digital transition, discuss the loss of physicality, and finally, wrap the whole thing up with an exam review.
Section 1. The Physical Library Experience, Establishing the Baseline of Sacks' Youth. So, to really understand what Sacks loses later in the essay, we first have to understand what he had. Oliver Sacks had this truly lifelong connection to physical stacks. Every major era of his life was anchored by a very specific physical space. Think about it. In his childhood, it was his family's oak-paneled library where he first discovered the Jungle Book. Then, in his youth, it was the Willesden Public Library. At university, he explored Oxford's magnificent Bodleian Library, including that crazy underground maze at Queen's College. And finally, during his career, he found refuge in the AMCOM Library. That's the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Each of these physical locations painstakingly built the very foundation of his intellect.
Now here is a piece of crucial vocabulary you absolutely should drop into your exam essay. Library. The prefix basically means primitive, original, or foundational. So for Sacks, his library was the Willesden Public Library. Even though he grew up in a house totally packed with books, it was this specific public building, just a 5-minute walk down the road, where he felt he received his real education. It was literally the origin point of his independent intellectual life.
And this brilliantly illustrates one of Sacks's absolute best literary techniques, his use of vivid, sensory details to really ground the reader. When you're writing your essay, you've got to pull quotes that highlight this physical, sensory nature of books. Because Sacks doesn't just talk about the information inside the texts, right? He talks about the oak-paneled rooms, the dust motes dancing in the light, the soft Morocco leather bindings of his mother's Kipling set, the gilt-edged pages of Milton, and of course the undeniable heft and smell of old volumes. He wants you to literally feel the library.
Section 2. Freedom and Serendipitous Discovery, the Magic of the Stacks.
Sacks sets up a brilliant thematic contrast here, which is honestly perfect to an exam essay comparing different modes of learning. On one side, you have his experience of traditional school. He describes it as incredibly passive, sitting in class, having instruction poured into him, information going in one ear and right out the other. He was restless, but contrast that with the library. The library represents active learning. In the Stacks, he was totally free to roam the aisles, select exactly what fascinated him, and engage in entirely self-directed education. The library was basically his domain of ultimate intellectual freedom.
All right, here is your second piece of vital exam vocabulary. Incunabula. These are ancient books, specifically early printed texts produced before the year 1501, though Sacks kind of uses the term affectionately for very old, rare works in general. Down in the subterranean catacombs of the Queen's College Library, Sacks describes the visceral thrill of holding these ancient texts in his own two hands. He marveled at a 1551 text adorned with Durer's drawing of a rhinoceros and original editions of Darwin and Gessner. He wasn't just reading history, he was physically touching it. And this physical roaming leads directly to what Sacks calls serendipitous discovery. He writes, "It was in the Bodleian that I stumbled upon the now obscure and forgotten works of Theodore Hook. Because he was physically walking through the stacks, he chanced upon this totally eccentric, forgotten 19th century writer. This serendipity was so powerful, it actually led Sacks to write a biography, a whole case history of Hook. I mean, think about it. A search engine gives you exactly what you type into it, right? But a physical library, it gives you the answers to questions you didn't even know you had."
Section 3. Community among the shelves, the camaraderie of readers.
Sacks also details how the shared physical space of a library fostered real intimacy. Reading might be solitary, but a library creates a shared experience. Think about his time at the ACOM Library. He describes these whispered conversations starting deep in the stacks when two people might reach for the exact same 1890-bound volume of a medical journal called Brain. He notes the quiet companionship of being surrounded by strangers all on their own individual quests. Even the physical book itself acted as a community artifact,
passing it back and forth, actually seeing the handwritten names and dates of previous readers right there on the checkout cards. It connected you to a whole lineage of thinkers.
Section 4. The 1990s Digital Transition, the Turning Point.
So the crucial point is, when Sachs returned to the library in the late 90s and saw the bare shelves, he experienced a profound, horrifying realization. He wrote, "I felt that a murder, a crime had been committed, the destruction of centuries of knowledge." He didn't just see a modern update. He didn't see a savvy administrative choice. No, he viewed the removal of physical books as a literal act of violence against history and knowledge itself.
Let's walk through the step-by-step tragedy of how this happened at the ACOM library. Mostly because Sachs points out just how quietly it all occurred. First, by the 1990s, students simply started ignoring the bookshelves, turning instead to glowing computer screens. Second, because of this lack of use, the physical books were deemed unnecessary by the majority. Third, the college made the administrative decision to systematically throw out the volumes. And finally, the shelves were left practically bare. And what alarmed Sachs most? The silence. This destruction happened with remarkably little public objection.
Section 5. The loss of physicality. What is left behind in the digital age? Now, what's really interesting here is the core conflict between digital efficiency and sensory history. On the one hand, modern administrators and librarians reassured Sachs that everything of worth has been digitized, basically saying the information is safe, don't worry. But Sachs held an unyielding perspective. To him, a physical book is irreplaceable, its look, its smell, its heft. For Sachs, a book is not merely a vehicle for data, it is a historical object, a sensory experience, and a physical companion.
All right, let's put on our critical thinking hats for a second. Here is a highly likely exam prompt you might face. What does the loss of the ACOM library's books actually represent to Sachs? I want you to synthesize the information we've just covered here. It's not just about missing paper, right? It represents the loss of much deeper thematic elements.
If you get that prompt on test day, here are the analytical answers you need to hit. First, it represents the loss of serendipity. You can cite his story of rummaging through the stacks in 1967 and randomly finding an 1873 book called Megrim by Edward Living, which, by the way, directly inspired Sachs' very first book. A digital search just doesn't allow for that kind of physical rummaging. Second, the loss represents a severed physical connection to history, no more holding incunabula. And third, it represents the destruction of that intimate, shared reader community, those whispered conversations over a dusty volume.
Section 6. Exam Review, Preparing Your Essay. Consider this your ultimate cheat sheet for the Grade 12 English exam. When you're writing about on libraries, make absolutely sure you reference these 4 core arguments. First, emphasize Sachs's belief in the sensory superiority of physical books, their smell, heft, and bindings. Second, discuss libraries as essential sanctuaries for self-directed, active learning, and contrast that with passive schooling. Third, highlight the irreplaceable magic of serendipitous discovery in physical stacks. And finally, analyze his profound grief over the silent tragedy of the digital transition, where centuries of physical knowledge were basically discarded without protest.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative question drawn directly from the text, a question Sachs was fiercely passionate about, and honestly, one that affects all of us today. Does a physical book offer something a screen cannot? Think about your own habits, your own learning, and your own libraries as you ponder Oliver Sachs' remarkable legacy. Good luck on your exams, and thank you so much for joining me in the Stacks today.